Our next guest, Michael Backman, author of Asian Eclipse, warns that more reforms are needed and issues like cronyism, corruption, poor corporate governance must be dealt with in order to achieve a more stable economic recovery. Now, Michael is based in Melbourne, but is passing through Singapore and joins us here in our Singapore studio. Michael, thanks very much for joining us on Squawk. It's good to have you.
Thank you.
Let me ask you, correct me if I'm wrong, but in your book, you're saying that the Asian way is the wrong way. Then what is the right way then?
Well, the right way is the modern way, the efficient, more sophisticated way. You can call it Western, you can call it being modern, whatever you like, but the right way is transparency, accountability, and things like that. That's really important. Institutions, that's what is required much more of here in Asia.
You're saying the right way is the Western way?
Not necessarily. The right way is the modern way. Sound legal systems, a lot of accountability, sound corporate governance, those sorts of things. That is important. Call it modern, call it being Western, call it what you like. Whatever it is, it works.
Michael, it's Bernard Lowe in Hong Kong. How in the world is Asia going to get itself out of the rut? How is it going to get out of doing things the wrong way and get on track doing things the right way, as long as families can hold up to 75% or more of companies and float just 1/4 of their interests on stock markets? Certainly cronyism, graft corruption is difficult to wipe out with those kind of vested interests involved.
You're exactly right. That has to change. There is no alternative. It must change. Really, there hasn't been enough reform in Asia for those sorts of things right now. What you're seeing is there's a lot of money, a lot of hot money is now pouring into the stock markets of the region. A lot of this money is completely unjustified, and I think because of the sort of reforms that need to take place haven't occurred nearly enough. And quite frankly, I think we're probably building up for another crash.
Michael, let me ask you, are you talking about Asia as a region, or are you talking about specific countries? Could you name specific countries that perhaps you think needs a lot more work, and some countries that you think, are actually quite stable?
Look, I think the next crash will be more discerning, because people will realise perhaps that Singapore has a lot of quality institutions and quality assets, and so Singapore won't be as harmed as much next time around. Malaysia is sort of dodgy, it can't quite make up its mind which way it's heading. I think Indonesia is heading for another downturn. Thailand, the reforms haven't gone nearly far enough, 2 steps forward, sometimes 3 steps backwards. So I think the next downturn will be more discerning. So you can certainly differentiate between the countries.
Michael, not to offend Singaporeans or anything, but even though Singapore is generally seen as doing its business above board, very transparent in its reporting and whatnot, and certainly we've seen the Singapore economy bounce back from the lows they hit in the last year and a half or so, but the fact remains that it is certainly not the most open economy. I mean, for instance, worldwide web access, internet access is very much limited. Censorship still is an official policy. The banks have been protected for 3 decades by Lee Kuan Yew.
That's certainly true, but you have to look at Singapore in a relative sense. You've got to compare it to the neighbours. I think when it comes to sound institutions, sound corporate governance and so on, Singapore performs quite well. It's certainly not perfect, but I think last year it did -1% in terms of its economic growth. Now that's nothing like, say, -15%. And so on. So if you look at it in a relative sense, it does perform quite well, but there's a lot more that can be done here in Singapore, and I think the Singapore government realises that.
Hi, I'm Tan Chong Kui from Kuala Lumpur, Firm Asset Management. I have a question. I'm seeing from fund managers' point of view. Generally, I notice that when the market price is too high, then it corrects. And sometimes when it's too high, it corrected very sharply. Irregardless of whatever policies you make or however transparent it is, how do you respond to that?
Well, I think at the end of the day, the prices are attached to the value of the fundamental underlying asset value, and I think what we're seeing now is too much money is pouring into the region relative to the reforms that have been made. The reforms haven't gone nearly far enough. And I think Asia is going to be rewarded for that. It will be rewarded with people pulling out the money. So I think it has gone very high. We are heading for quite a serious correction. As I said before to Christine, I think the correction will be more discerning. People are probably much more educated now in America and so on, more educated about the regional differences, the internal differences between, say, Malaysia and Indonesia. I think they'll realise that the ringgit is not the rupiah, Malaysia is not Indonesia, even if they sound the same, whereas I think before there wasn't enough differentiation. People were sort of hitting the button and sort of saying, sell rupiah, sell ringgit, it all sounds the same. So I think that at least this coming crash, there'll be a lot more recognition of some of the differences and some of the reforms and the relative differences between the countries.
Michael, we'll talk a bit about this crash that you're talking about later. Catch up with you then. Now stay right where you are. We'll be right back with Michael in just a moment. Don't go away. Now let's continue our discussion with Michael Backman, author of Asian Eclipse, Exposing the Dark Side of Business in Asia. Now I believe Dr. Tan has a question for you, Michael. Dr. Tan?
Hi, Mr. Backman. Just to continue, from a fund manager point of view, I always think that when people are optimistic, they are over-optimistic. Just like in US now, people are quite worried that, the market is too high and is expected to have a strong correction, hopefully not a crash. That's why I tend to think that, this over-optimism is the one that will give problem rather than, of course, to have transparency is good. US is most transparent. Does it mean that US, if continue to go up, will not have a crash or will not have a sharp correction?
I certainly agree with you. You're quite right. The markets do have a tendency to overshoot in both directions. When you've got a bull run, it tends to go up far too high. If you've got a bear run, it goes far too much in the other direction. But I think it's fair to say that the current euphoria is way too excessive because the reforms have not been made. You're quite right, but however, I'm not so sure that we will have a correction. I think some of the countries could well be heading for a crash. If you look at the Indonesian stock market, the Jakarta Stock Exchange, I mean, it really isn't a stock exchange, it's a casino. The reforms in Indonesia, well, there have been basically very few reforms. We have no idea who the leader of that country is going to be. And whether it's Megawati or Habibie, I mean, what sort of choice is that? I feel very, very pessimistic about a country like Indonesia. In many other countries as well, the stock market, even this morning, you can see on the screen at the bottom here, the prices are going up again. Really, where are the reforms to justify this? They simply are not there.
Michael,
and what I'll say one more thing. What is absolutely important is the institutions, the rule of law. And if you don't have a sound rule of law, you don't have sound accountability and corporate governance and so on, all investment into these stock markets qualifies as speculation, all of it. It doesn't matter whether it's there for 1 month or 5 years. If you don't have the rule of law to protect you and to protect minority shareholders, all of this investment qualifies as speculation.
Michael, if I could play devil's advocate for just a second here and do a bit of a diatribe in defense of cronyism, there certainly a while back that Lee Kuan Yew, the senior minister of Singapore, came out with lamenting about some of the downsides to some of the changes in Indonesia. He was saying that under Suharto, the economy was growing 9 to 10% a year, and he said, and he acknowledged that, sure, he probably wasted 2, 3, 4% on cronies and family members, but he did bring growth. I'm not sure what Senior Minister Lee meant by that, but would it be fair to say that the cronyism, the graft that was a hallmark of a lot of the growth we saw in many parts of Asia, necessary for the times back when, the economies were powering ahead?
Certainly there is an argument that some aspects of cronyism can be quite useful in the short term because particularly when you've got an obstructionist, poorly paid and corrupt bureaucracy, which is exactly what you have in Thailand, China and in Indonesia, well then cronyism allows you to cut through that. So in some respects, in the short term, cronyism can actually improve economic growth. But the trouble is, at the end of the day, if you're a crony and the politicians that you've linked up with suddenly disappear overnight, well then your investment is unprotected and you're in trouble. That is no way to build a strong economy for the long term.
All right, Michael, we're running out of time, but we have to leave it at that. Thanks very much for joining us on Squawk Box this morning. Good to have you.
Thank you very much.
Michael Backman, author of the book Asian Eclipse. Now stick around for more of Squawk Box. Bernie will wrap up his stocks to watch and a final word with our guest host, Dan Chong-Kui. Don't go away.